So cool. Now we have the auth handler and the hash handler. We can now create the service and start integrating the functionality. So let's go ahead into this app folder and let's create another folder called service. This will house our service layer. Call it service. And the first service that I want to create is the user service. So let's do user service.py. All right, so let's make a couple of imports that we'll need. So first, we're going to need the repository because the service layer is going to be using the repository to communicate and make queries to the database. So let's do from app.db.repository, and let's do user repository and import the user repository. The second import that I need is the schemas because I want to make sure that the data is structured in a way that I expect. Receiving the data from the router and outputting the data back to the router in the expected format. So let's do from app.db.schema.user. And let's just import all that we'll need. So we're going to need the user output. We're going to need the user in create because the service will have the sign up function, which will create the user using the create user method that we created in the repository. And then we're going to need user in login because we're going to create a function or a method to handle logins. And then we're going to do user with token because we're going to output back a token to give the user back a token. Speaking of token, we're going to need those handlers that we just created. So let's go ahead and do from app.core.security.hashHelper import the hash helper. And also we can do from app.core.security.authhandler import authhandler. The next thing we'll need is the session because we're going to be passing a session to the repository to instantiate it. So let's do from SQLalchemy.orm import session. And then from FastAPI, right, we want to import an HTTP exception because if there's any issues that arise while attempting to process any information in the service layer, we want to throw an HTTP exception with the proper status code and with the proper detail. So cool, that's all the imports that we'll need. Let's actually create the class for the user service. So let's just do class user service and we're going to do an init, right? Because we expect to be passed a session. And that's what we imported session because we're going to make sure that this is of type session and open that up. And now I'm going to instantiate the user repository. So let's do self dots and I'm just going to put 2 underscores here and call this user repository. And I'm going to make that equal to an instance of user repository and pass that session that we are expecting someone to pass when they instantiate the user service, which we'll do from the router. So yeah, now we have access to the user repository. And now if you want to make any calls using the user repository, we could do that. So we can do user repository and self dot user repository. And let me erase that. And now we have access to the methods that we just created. So we can see that we have the create user, get user by email, get user by ID. So we can use that in this layer to make calls to our database, to make queries to our database and retrieve that information. So let's go ahead with the first method in here and we're going to do the sign up. So let's do df sign up. Let's do self. And what we expect for sign up is the user in creates, right? We want the structure of the user create schema. So let's call this user underscore details and it's going to be of type user in create. And what we're expecting to output back to router is the user output. My first dot is to first check if any users are using the email that the user is attempting to sign up with. If the user already exists, I will throw a HTTP exception with a bad request status code that will inform the user to log in still already exist. So let's go ahead and do that. So if self dot, and then we're going to use the underscore user repository and check if the user exists by email. Because remember, user exists by email in the repository, and I can go to the definition. We'll check if a user exists in the user table by that email, and it's going to return a boolean in this case. The get user by email returns the actual user, but the user exists by email will return a boolean. So that's perfect for this if statement. And all we got to do is pass the email, which is going to be in our user details. So user details dot email. And perfect. So if it's true, if it actually exists, then we'll raise an HTTP exception, and I'm going to pass a status code of 400 because that's a bad request. And we'll do details equal to please log in. So if the user doesn't exist in the user table, we can go ahead and create the user. And this is where the hash helper will shine, because before we save the user to this user table, we want to make sure that we hash the password, because we don't want to place plain text passwords into databases, right? We want to make sure that it's hashed so that if there's any issues with our security and people are able to get into our database, then at least we know that the most important sensitive stuff is not just sitting there in plain text. So let's do that really quick. Let's do hashed underscore password is equal to the hash helper. Remember, this is a static class with static methods. We don't have to instantiate it. So all we got to do is do dot get hash or get password hash and pass the plain password. So I'm gonna do plain password is going to equal to user details dot password, right? And we know that this is going to be here because the user in create requires that information. So if it got to this point, that means that it's been validated and it's proper. So now that we have the hashed password, we can now go ahead and assign the user details to be equal to that password. So we're going to go ahead and access that password, and now it's going to be equal to the hash password. And then what we're going to return is self dot underscore user repository dot create user, with the user data being the user details, right? And it's gonna go ahead and take that user details, dump it into a user model, then it's gonna save that model into our table. So then the user will be signed up and created. That user can now log in. And speaking of login, let's actually create the logic for that. But it's pretty simple, right? We check if the user exists, if the email is already in the table or in our database, then we can go ahead and raise that exception because they can just log in. But if not, then go ahead and hash a password, change the plain text password to the hash password, and go ahead and create that user. And we know that the format is as expected because we're using a schema, and that schema makes sure that it's in the format and it has the data that we need to actually create the user. Now let's go ahead and do login. Let's do df login and pass the instance of self. And what we're going to do is pass in the login details. And for login, I expect the structure of the login details to be of type user in login, which is just email and password. And what we're going to output here is the user with token, which is just going to be a token. So here it's going to kind of be the opposite, right? If a user doesn't have an email in our database, then that means we can go ahead and raise that exception. You got to create an account. You can't log in with an email we don't even have. So let's go ahead and do that. Self dot underscore user repository, and user exists by email, and go ahead and pass that email, which is passed from the login details. And we'll go ahead and raise an HTTP exception, and the status code is going to be 400, and the detail will be equal to please create an account. Cool. So the difference here is it's not, right? So if this returns false, meaning okay, there's no user with this email in our user table, then it will return true for the if statement, and it will raise the exception, right? Because it is true that the user does not exist in our table, which means that we gotta let them know, please create an account. But in the case that it is true, the user does exist, then this is going to return false. It's going to skip over this, and we can actually attempt to log in. And we're going to use another one of our methods in the user repository, which is the get user by email, because I want to get the user information. So we're going to do user equal to self dot underscore user repository dot get user by email. And we have the email. We'll just do email equal to login details dot email. So this will grab everything related to the user, including the password. And we're going to need that hash password to do the comparison between the plain text password that the user passed in the login details to the hash password that's being stored in the table. So we could do if hash helper dot verify password, which will take in the plain password, which is, I just put that for clarity. The plain password will be the login details dot password, right? And the hash password, which is what we just queried for. So we can do hash password is going to be equal to the user dot password, right? Now, this verified password will return true or false. If it's valid, like these two match, it's going to return true, and we can return a token. Now, if it's false, then we can go ahead and erase exception. So let's do the true criteria first. So we're going to attempt to grab a token. Like it says that this password is correct. We're going to try to generate a token. And if it's able to generate a token properly, then we're going to return the token. So token is going to be equal to the auth handler dot sign JWT. And it's going to be past the user ID. Because remember, we're going to utilize the user ID as a payload and send the JWT tokens with our request. We'll be able to grab that payload, grab the user ID, make any queries that we need, and verify that it's the user that we expect to interact with our application. So we can check if it actually exists by doing if token, right? Return the user with token, and it's just going to take in the token as a parameter and return that back to the user. Else, there's a fallback. It's going to raise an HTTP exception. If it's not able to sign a token, that means it's us probably. And we're going to return a internal server error. And I'm just going to say that unable to process request. This is also a place that if any issues arise, you could probably send like an email or something like that to like your admin of your application just to figure out why is this happening. But I'm just going to raise an exception here. But that's a good idea to probably alert somebody of why, right? Or at least monitor it or something like that. Then there's the outside raise exception, because if we're unable to verify that these passwords actually match, then that means it's not on us. Please check your credentials. Let's raise an HTTP exception, and I'm going to call this status code of 400. It is a bad request because they didn't pass the proper details. So please check your credentials. We've got an E here. Check your credentials. And yeah, that's pretty much the login flow. We check if a user exists. If it does exist, then we can go ahead and log in. If it doesn't exist, then you got to go ahead and create an account. And I'll let them know using the exception. If they do exist, then I'll retrieve their information using the get user by email. And then with their plain password that they provided in the login request, I will check against their hash password that's saved in the user table. And if it is matching, then I'll generate a token and return that token to them. If not, then I'll send an exception telling them, please check your credentials. And there's a case that, okay, for some reason I'm unable to sign the JWT token, then I go ahead and raise a internal server error.